tardes. Le damos la más cordial bienvenida a la continuación de nuestro segundo día del seminario sobre la actualidad del pensamiento de Hegel, titulado ¿Cuál debe ser el comienzo de la ciencia? Ahora, para continuar con nuestra jornada, tengo el agrado de presentarles a la profesora Michela Bordignon, que nos va a ofrecer la cuarta y última conferencia magistral. Michela Bordignon es profesora de la Universidade Federal do ABC en Brasil, hizo sus estudios de filosofía y ha desarrollado sus proyectos de investigación en las siguientes universidades: en la Università degli Studi di Padova, en Warwick University, en la Pontificia Universidad Católica do Rio Grande do Sul y Universidad Federal do Espíritu Santo. El campo de sus investigaciones comprende las relaciones entre lógica formal y lógica especulativa, el debate en torno a la concepción hegeliana de la teleología, la vida y el organismo, y la relación entre la filosofía de Hegel y la metafísica del proceso. Ha sido vicepresidenta del grupo de trabajo Hegel Brasil. Es también coeditora del número de la revista de la Sociedad Hegeliana de Brasil, dedicado al tema Hegel en palabras de las mujeres. Ha publicado asimismo el libro En los límites de la verdad, el problema de la contradicción en la lógica de Hegel en el año 2015, y numerosos artículos sobre los temas de sus investigaciones en revistas especializadas. Michela Bordignon nos va a ofrecer ahora una conferencia en inglés titulada El antifundacionalismo y la teoría procesual de la verdad. Sin más, entonces, le doy el paso a la profesora Michela Bordignon. Adelante, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por tu amable invitación, por tu generosa presentación. Es un placer y un honor para mí poder presentar algunas de ellas en el contexto de este seminario. Me disculpo por no dar mi presentación en español. Voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés, pero por favor puedes hacer sus comentarios y preguntas en español. Y agradezco de antemano por su atención y paciencia. Now I switch to English because I realized my Spanish is not so good. I share my text as the other speakers did, and I start reading my talk. So the title of the talk is Anti-Foundationalism and the Process Theory of Truth. In this talk, I would like to present some ideas on a theory of truth on the basis of some consideration on the section with what must the beginning of science be made. This is the outline of some intuition that I have that have to do with a dialogue between Hegel and process philosophy, a dialogue on which I've been working in the last year of my research. My ideas, put in very general terms, is to go back to analyzing the processual character of Hegelian anti-foundationalism to show how it relates with an equally processual conception of truth within the Hegelian system. And my aim at the end would be to understand how this conception of truth can be located in the contemporary debate on the theories of truth. So in order to expound upon the relationship between anti-foundationalism and Hegel's theory of truth, I will divide my talk into three parts. In the first part, I will make explicit the relationship between anti-foundationalism and the Hegelian conception of truth. In the second part, I will relate the notion of foundation and what is founded with the notions of a truth maker and truth bearer, showing that the processual character of Hegelian anti-foundationalism implies in his conception of truth the questioning of a fixed distinction between these two notions. And in the third part, I will investigate the implication of this questioning in Hegel's theory of truth, which leads it to assume a specific position with respect to the conceptual core of the correspondence, coherence, and pragmatist theories of truth. So I start with the first part on anti-foundationalism, on the relation between anti-foundationalism and Hegel's theory of truth. In the section with what must the beginning of science be made, Hegel considers a series of problems related to the beginning of science, but also to the development of science itself. Precisely on this topic, the section touches on a series of fundamental issues related to the anti-foundationalist approach that Hegel endorses in his philosophical system. Hegel presents a concept of science that is defined both as a discourse free from any kind of presupposition and at the same time as a system in which truth is defined as totality, that is the complete development of the concept of science. In this sense, the very beginning of the system, while coinciding with the freedom from presuppositions and therefore with an absolutely abstract and indeterminate logical content, is a moment of truth. In fact, the beginning of science is indeed a void, but it is a dynamic void that generates, through the dialectic of being and nothing, the logical Big Bang which is becoming. This indeterminacy of the beginning is at the origin of the whole system of science and therefore of truth, all the way up to its full disclosure of mediation and conceptual determination in absolute idea. The absolutely indeterminate logical content of the beginning unfolds its complete truth only in the complete development of the system itself. Its truth, therefore, finds its foundation in the progressive articulation of all the moments of the system of science. I would like to go back to a well-known passage in the pages dedicated to the analysis of the problem of the beginning, in which Hegel presents his anti-foundationalist approach. I quote, "Progression in philosophy would be rather a retrogression and a grounding, only by virtue of which it then follows as result that that with which the beginning was made was not just an arbitrary assumption, but was in fact the truth, the first truth." And I'm quoting the Di Giovanni translation of the Science of Logic. Hegel, therefore, is criticizing and abandoning the strategy of identifying a foundation that works according to a top-down dynamic. There is no initial foundation that would justify all the components of the system from the beginning. Rather, Hegel rethinks the very notion of foundation according to a bottom-up dynamic. The truth is shown to be a result that includes its own process of generation. That is, truth is a process that starts from the absolute freedom from presuppositions, which is shown to be the first moment of truth itself, the first necessary condition for its determination, or, as Hegel puts it, the first truth. Hence, Hegel's anti-foundationalism does not imply a renunciation of the search for truth or of the attempt to find a proper foundation or justification of truth itself and of philosophy as science. On the contrary, Hegel's anti-foundationalism takes on the challenge of radically rethinking the very notion of foundation. As William Maker points out in his Philosophy Without Foundation, we can say that, and I quote, Hegel's system emerges as a non-foundational philosophy which incorporates some contemporary criticism of foundationalism without abandoning philosophy's traditional goal of offering demonstrable objective truth. In fact, the articulation of a philosophical system starting from a beginning free from presuppositions is justified by the awareness of the problem of classical foundationalism and on the basis of the pretense of not presupposing any truth as given, as not properly founded and justified. On the other hand, the anti-foundationalist structure of the Hegelian system aims at the articulation of a properly founded foundation and therefore of a properly justified truth. This mediation process takes place within and through the immanent development of the system. In this sense, it is evident that the anti-foundationalist approach on which Hegel's logical system is built is intrinsically connected with the way in which Hegel conceives of truth and of its justification. Within the section dedicated to the problem of the beginning of the science, Hegel explicitly relates his anti-foundationalism, his anti-foundationalist conception to the immanent development of the truth of the system. I quote, "Progression is a retreat to the ground, to the origin and the truth on which that with which the beginning was made and from which it is in fact produced depends. Thus, consciousness on its forward path from the immediacy from which it began is led back to the absolute knowledge, which is its innermost truth." Along these lines, Hegel goes back to think the anti-foundationalist approach developed throughout the phenomenological path. In the phenomenology as well as in the system, the beginning is an immediate content, a first truth whose immanent dialectical development corresponds to the process of determination of this content. The result of this development is the proper foundation of the initial immediate content. In this result, the truth of the initial immediate content finds its complete systematic articulation. I quote, "Essential to science is not so much that the pure immediacy should be the beginning, but that the whole of science is in itself a circle in which the first become also the last, and the last also the first." End of quote. Hence, the development of the system has a circular structure in which the beginning and the end of the system coincide while maintaining a constitutive difference at the same time. Such difference ensures that the actual indeterminacy of the beginning produces an absolute richness of content of the completion of the system. This means that the immanent development of the immediate beginning is not the result of a simple analysis of the content that is already available from the very beginning of the system. On the contrary, this development is a process in which truth emerges as something which is enriched through progressive degrees of determination. There is within the system a single truth, but this truth is not already given at the beginning of the system. There is within the system, rather, it is a truth which is its own making, its own producing itself in a process of determination of its various forms of existence. So what does all this imply with respect to Hegel's theory of truth in its procesual character? In the second part of the talk, I would try to shed light on this point through the reference to two notions that are commonly used in the contemporary analysis of theories of truth, namely the notions of truth maker and truth bearer. In the second part, on Hegel's theory of truth that is interpreted through the lens of these two notions, truth maker and truth bearer. In the first part of the talk, I showed that Hegel's anti-foundationalism is intrinsically related to Hegel's theories of truth. In the second part, I will investigate this relation between anti-foundationalism and truth, and so the relation between a truth needing a foundation and the foundation provided in the logic by using two key notions of the contemporary debate on truth theories, that is, the notions of truth bearer and truth maker. In this context, in the context of the debate of analytic philosophy, truth bearer are commonly considered as propositions. In reality, there is a wide debate over whether to attribute the role of truth bearer to propositions, beliefs, or sentences. I do not have the space or competences to reconstruct this debate, but I do not believe that this limitation represents a particularly relevant problem here. Suffice it to consider that truth bearer are traditionally considered as something pertaining to the sphere of the thought of rational agents or of the language that expresses it, that is, of what we think and say. Instead, when we talk about truth maker within the contemporary debate, in general terms, one refers to what makes a proposition true or false. Maurizio Ferraris relates the notion of truth bearer to the very notion of foundation, when he states that, I quote, the former, truth maker, would be the ontological foundation of a true proposition, and of course here, Maurizio Ferraris is referring to the correspondence theory of truth. So my idea is to relate the notion of truth bearer to the notion of foundation and the notion of the notion of truth maker to the notion of foundation and the notion of truth bearer to the notion of what is founded. In the analytic debate, truth bearer and truth maker are two distinct notions. I will inquire how we could interpret this notion in Hegel's logic, thinking of truth maker as the foundation of truth bearer, and reflect it on the anti-foundationalist approach presented in the first part of my talk. A preliminary consideration is necessary. In Hegel's logic, of course, truth is not something that pertains to propositions, sentences, or beliefs, but it is something characterizing logical determinations, namely the pure logical forms, which certainly are expressed through proposition, but which do not have primarily propositional nature and are not reducible to merely propositional structure. Hegel claims, I quote, the necessary forms of thinking and its specific determination are the content and the ultimate truth itself, end of quote. And one could ask, are logical determination in Hegel's logic truth bearer or truth maker? My impression is that every logical determination of the system is both a truth bearer and a truth maker to the extent that each determination is a moment of the process generating the truth, namely the bearer of this same truth and at the same time a condition of possibility for this process to take place. Therefore, its determination is one of the protagonists of the process that makes, produces, and founds this truth. Hegel's theory of truth does radically question the difference between these two notions, which, in the contemporary philosophical debate, are quite distinct. As I have already pointed out, this does not mean that Hegel renounces to identify a foundation, a justification for the truth that he presents in the logical system. The foundation relation, however, is no longer a relation between two fixedly distinct components, but it is a dynamic foundational relationship in which foundation and what is founded, or we can say the truth bearer and the truth maker, must be understood in their difference as much as in their identity. In a further passage taken from the section on the beginning of science, Hegel claims, I quote, it follows that it is just as necessary to consider as result that into which the movement returns as to its ground. In this respect, the first is just as much the ground, and the last a derivative. Since the movement makes it start from the first and by correct inferences arrive at the last as the ground, the last is result. Further, the advance from this that which constitutes the beginning is to be considered only as one more determination of the same advance, so that this beginning remains as the underlying ground of all what that follows without vanishing from it. End of quote. The process of self-determination of thought of the logical system has a circular structure, and it can be considered in two different directions crossing each other, where every logical determination is as much as truth bearer as truth maker, that is, as much a moment of truth founded by the other moments, and as much as a moment that founds the truth itself. So the process of self-determination of truth can be seen, quoting Franco Piereghin, from the side of development of the process of self-determination of thought, and therefore as a generative process of truth. From this perspective, every determination generates and thus grounds the truth of the determination following it. In this sense, as Hegel writes in the lines just quoted, the first is just as much the ground and the last a derivative, or the first determination is a truth maker and the second a truth bearer. The immediate beginning is the first foundation of the truth that we encounter fully disclosed in the absolute idea. But the same process of determination of truth, however, can also be considered from what Piereghin calls the side of truth, of the process itself. That is a truth that finds its complete foundation only at the end of the system. From this perspective, Hegel claims, I quote, this beginning remains at the underlying ground of what that followed, and every determination is already the bearer of a truth that finds its complete foundation, its mediation, or its further determination in the determination that it dialectically produces. So its determination is thus a truth bearer, that is to say, it is the bearer of a truth that finds what makes it true, that is its foundation, its truth maker, only in the subsequent determination that it generates. So to sum up, every determination is a truth bearer that finds what makes it true, its truth maker, its foundation, only for the determinations that it itself grounds. However, each determination is equally a truth bearer, namely bearer of a truth that the same determination is generating, making, grounding. Every determination, therefore, is as much truth bearer as it is truth maker of the process of self-determination of the truth of pure thought. Someone might object that the sense in which every determination is a truth bearer and truth maker with respect to the process of thought self-determination is different, and that therefore the distinction between the two notions in Hegel's logic is not really put into question. Anyway, the truth considered from the side of its development or from the side of truth itself is one and the same truth. Quoting again, we could say that, quote, Hegel shows how what is placed at the beginning as the foundation of proving and mediating is at the end of the argumentative development turns out to be founded precisely on what it has been proved. End of quote. Therefore, the initial truth maker, that is the beginning of the system, is the foundation of the generation of all the logical determination of pure thought, which, in the complete unfolding of its logical form, is in and for itself what is supremely true. Absolute idea is what can be paradigmatically considered a truth bearer, because the truth it bears is absolute. However, this fully unfolded truth also turns out to be what makes true, the truth maker, the beginning from which it resulted and the process of its own generation. In this sense, in this dialectical development of Hegel's logic, truth bearer and truth maker are no longer in a situation of fixed distinction. At the same time, even if this distinction is placed in question, it is not entirely eliminated by Hegel. As I already pointed out, Hegel does not renounce the idea of identifying a proper foundation of the philosophical discourse. On the contrary, he tries to identify a foundation that does not fall prey of the lack of justification of classical foundationalism. In order to do that, he needs to rethink the very notion of foundation, and this leads him to rethink also the difference between foundation and what is founded, and their mutual determination. Correspondingly, therefore, Hegel also rethinks the relationship between what is now defined truth maker and truth bearer. There is still a difference between two notions that are not related as something given, independent, self-subsistent, that is, two notions that are not permanently distinct from one another. To understand the dynamic that plays in Hegel's logic between truth bearer and truth maker, or between foundation and founded, it is first of all necessary to deconstruct the givenness of this notion and think about the processual character. In speculative logic, the bearer of truth are not propositions, sentences, or beliefs that may have the property of being true or false. The truth bearer are logical determinations that are true insofar as they correspond to their concept, where the correspondence relationship is not given, but is progressively produced by the determinations themselves. What bears the truth is at the same time what produces it through its immanent developmental process. What founds and produces the truth determination, the truth maker, is not once again a datum external and independent of the determinations themselves, because the truth maker is an immanent dialectic, of determination. What establishes and produces the truth of the determinations is intrinsically implied by what the bearer of this truth, that is, the determination themselves. Then the truth in Hegel's logic both is in its being born by the determination, in its being produced by the determination, is never something given, but it is a process, it is a making, a producing, a self-determining of the determination themselves. For this reason, we cannot speak of an abstract difference between truth-bearer and truth-maker. I quote, the advance does not consist in the derivation of another or in the transition to a truly other. Inasmuch as there is a transition, it is equally sublated again. Thus, the beginning of philosophy is the ever-present and self-preserving foundation of all subsequent developments, remaining everywhere immanent in its further determination. And of course, the truth that its determination dialectically produces is not the truth other than that of the determination itself, and therefore the foundation is not distinct from that which is founded, or the truth maker is not different from the truth that it justifies, because the truth maker makes and found its own truth. At the same time, we cannot speak even of an abstract identity between truth bearer and truth maker. I quote, in this advance, the beginning thus loses the one-sidedness that it has when determined simply as something immediate and abstract. It becomes mediated, end of quote. So the truth that every determination dialectically produces is therefore not a truth available already from the beginning of the system. That is, it is not a truth that is analytically made explicit starting from a given initial foundation. From the beginning, we have a progressive synthesis of an increasingly rich and complex logical content. Its determination is indeed a truth bearer and also a truth maker that grounds a truth that is its own truth, but which at the same time develops into a further determination that carries a further degree of mediation and truth. At the same time, this further determination is the truth maker, or the foundation in which the previous determination reaches the correspondence to its concept and thus to its concrete truth. Therefore, in the relationship between truth bearer and truth maker in speculative logic, both the identity and difference between truth bearer and truth maker must be accounted for. And this identity and difference must be understood, I think, in the sense of a processual unity between truth bearer and truth maker, that is, between foundation and what is founded. This processual character emerges when Hegel underlines the circular character of the development of science, which is, with it, of the process of self-determination of the truth of pure thought. I quote, and the line of scientific forward movement consequently turns into a circle. It also follows that what constitutes the beginning, because it is something still undeveloped and empty of content, is not yet truly known at the beginning, and that only science, and science fully developed, is the completed cognition of it, replete with content and finally truly grounded. End of quote. So the circular development of the logical system and its truth therefore corresponds to the process of self-determination of the truth that from the 0 degree of determination reaches the maximum degree of mediation in the absolute idea. It is not a truth already given at the beginning of the dialectical process, that is, it is not a truth already present that needs to be simply known and made explicit. I quote, that with which the beginning is to be made cannot be anything concrete, anything contained in a connection within itself. It is because, as such, it would presuppose within itself a process of mediation and the transition from the first to another, of which process the concrete something now become a simple would be a result. But the beginning ought not itself to be already a first and another, for anything which is in itself a first and another implies that an advance has already been made. Consequently, that which constitutes the beginning itself, is to be taken as something unanalyzable, taken in its simple, unfilled immediacy, and therefore as being as complete emptiness. And of course, so what we encounter at the beginning, as well as in any logical determination, is therefore a truth that concretely needs to be developed, determined, and mediated. The truth of every determination is intrinsically processual, because every determination, more than a truth bearer, is a truth bearing. That is something that brings the truth itself to a further degree of mediation. to the extent that every determination is not so much a truth maker, but a truth making. That is something that produces the same truth that it bears. Considering this processual and anti-foundationalist character of the truth in Hegel's logic, I will present in the final part of the talk at least some consideration on the way in which this theory of truth could be situated within the contemporary debate on truth theories. So Hegel today, a processual theory of truth. After the general consideration on the processual character of the Hegelian theory of truth, I will present some general ideas on how this theory, far from being completely extraneous to the theory of truth present in the contemporary debate, allows, I think, to criticize and rethink the fundamental conceptual core. This can be done precisely by considering the anti-foundationalist relationship between truth bearer and truth maker that I referred to in the second part of my talk. I hope this brief consideration will be at least useful in the course of the debate to reflect on the possible relevance of the Hegelian theory of truth within the contemporary debate. This debate is obviously very complex, and I will limit myself to referring in very general terms to three theories of truth, of the three main theories of truth: correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism theories of truth. The idea that I would like to propose is that the Hegelian theory of truth can constitute an interesting critique of what could be defined as a myth of truth as given, heterodetermined and heterofounded with respect to the process of constitution of truth itself. In both correspondence theory and coherent theories, but also in the pragmatist theories, truth is, I think, thought of as a property of a truth bearer, that is a proposition, a belief, a theory, that is founded and determined by a given truth maker, namely something external, other than the proposition, belief, or theory in question. So I believe that the Hegelian theories of truth can be used as a basis to criticize, but also to rethink this relationship of heterodetermination of truth, both in its correspondence version, as in its coherence version, as well as in its pragmatic version, precisely on the basis of Hegel's anti-foundationalism. Truth, according to Hegel, is determined not on the basis of a relationship between two elements external to each other, a truth bearer and a truth maker, but on the basis of a dynamic and internal relationship to thought itself, and more in general, on the basis of a conception of reason as bearer and generator of a truth that claims to be properly objective. So let's start with the correspondence theory of truth. In the correspondence theories of truth, a proposition is true if and only if it corresponds to facts. A true proposition is stands in a certain relationship to something that is independent of the proposition itself with a fact of a state of affairs. The relation in question basically consists in the fact that the proposition, the truth bearer, and the state of affairs to which it corresponds, the truth maker, have the same structure. So the proposition that states that the snow is white is true if and only if it corresponds to the state of affairs concerning the snow, and if the snow has the property of being white. The truth of the proposition is therefore determined and founded by a given fact or state of affairs, external and independent of the proposition and of the subject who thinks it. Hegel's conception of truth allows to elaborate a radical critique of this theory, as well as a redefinition, I think, of its conceptual core. In fact, on the one hand, anti-foundationalism in itself radically questions the idea that thought can find the foundation of its own truth, that is, its own truth maker, in something given, external, and independent. In one of the many passages in which Hegel critically refers to the correspondence theory of truth, he claims, I quote, "Truth is the agreement of thought with the subject matter, and in order to produce this agreement, for it is not there on its own account, the thought is expected to be subservient and responds to the subject matter. Consequently, the thought receives and informs the material. It does not transcend itself, but its reception of this material and its responsiveness to it remain a modification of itself. Thus, thought does not become its other. The self-consciousness determining at any rate belongs only to it, even as it refers to the subject matter, therefore it does not reach out to it outside itself, end of quote. In other words, the conception of the foundation of truth as a datum external to thought implies the impossibility to reach this same foundation. The critique of foundationalism is therefore necessarily accompanied by the critique to the classical correspondence conception of truth. Quoting William Maker, the denial of foundationalism and the rejection of its correlative notion of privileged representation that corresponds to theories of truth and a transcendental subject would thus seem to represent at least a paradigm shift. And this paradigm change does not involve a total abandonment of Hegel of the idea of truth as correspondence, I think. Rather, it leads to rethink of this relationship in anti-foundationalist terms. In Hegelian logic, pure thought, as well as every determination of pure thought, has no foundation, no truth-making in a datum external to thought itself. But it is true to the extent that it corresponds to a foundation that it itself makes, produces, and develops in its own self-determining process. In this way, in Hegel's theory of truth, one can recognize also the conceptual core of the coherence theories of truth. According to coherence theories, the proposition is true if it is coherent with a set of propositions with which it is related. Thus, for example, according to Joachim, I quote, the truth is the essential nature, is that truth in its essential nature is that systematic coherence, which is the character of a significant whole. The foundation of the truth of a proposition, therefore, is some kind of coherence that characterizes the internal relationship between a given set of propositions. Rethinking the correspondence relation as a correspondence not between proposition and a content external to thought, but as a processual correspondence of pure thought with respect to its own content, leads Hegel to conceive truth in terms that seems to be close to coherence theories of truth. As William Maker points out, I quote, because the rejection of foundationalism is conjoined with the claim that knowledge is determined by the context in which the knower is located, anti-foundationalism generally can be said to endorse holism, that conception of knowledge according to which truth is defined not in terms of correspondence to object, but as the coherence of claims within the frame of reference defined by the tradition, style of discourse, or set of linguistic or social practices in which the knower is located. End of quote. So likewise, truth in Hegel's logic cannot therefore be conceived in terms of a property of a belief, proposition, and sentences isolated from the systematic context in which it is situated. And it does not depend on a foundation which is external to the system itself. On the contrary, truth constitutes itself on the basis of the system of determination as a coherent and organically determined whole. However, my impression is that even coherentist theories are unable, to completely free themselves from the dependence of a foundation of truth that is given and independent on the development of truth itself. In fact, the foundation of coherence theories is, first of all, the criterion for determining coherence, which is assumed as a given presupposition and which is external to the process of determining the truth value of a proposition. In some version of the coherence theories, coherence is interpreted in purely logical formal terms, and therefore coherence is equivalent to simple consistency. In other version of the theory, coherence is a system of given relations, whereby a proposition is true if and only if it is implied by one or more members of the system in which it is included. Secondly, the set of propositions with respect to which the coherence relation is considered is equally given and presupposed. In some version of the theory, this set corresponds to the largest possible set of consistent propositions that rational agents actually consider to be true. In other version, the set of propositions in question contains all the propositions that would be considered as true by an omniscient being. These are, of course, just two examples of definition of the set of coherent propositions. However, both cases, both examples, show that the truth of the set, far from being demonstrated and justified, is presupposed as given. In the first case, it is given in the community of rational agents, and in the second one, it is given in the mind of the omniscient being. The only thing that the subject can do is simply to make explicit this truth and the relationship of coherence that underlies it. Furthermore, the risk of coherence theory is clear. In determining the truth, the subject runs the risk of remaining closed within the set of coherent beliefs presupposed as true, losing the ability to account for actual reality. In fact, there may be two propositions not coherent with the set of propositions considered as true, or false proposition coherent with it. The risk is made explicit by what is called specification problem. I can consider two incompatible propositions. Michela is Italian and Michela is not Italian. And these two propositions can both be consistent with two different sets of propositions. In this case, I have no real basis for determining which of the two propositions is true and which is false. Obviously, a coherent theorist might reply that the set of two propositions assumed as reference is not arbitrary, but it is the set of propositions that is assumed as to be true. Therefore, the truth of the set is, as we have seen, presupposed and assumed as the foundation of the truth of each proposition that is part of the set. The coherent theorist refuses to appeal to a foundation of truth of thought in a datum external to thought. I think it internalizes this foundation within thought itself. The problem is that this foundation remains something given presupposed and not properly justified. Hegel has already been included in the team of philosophers who assume a coherence theory of truth. But at the same time, I think that Hegel also always has to interpret the relationship of coherence as foundation of truth internal to thought in anti-foundationalist terms. And so I think that he always to criticize the coherence theory of truth. So, looking at Hegel's truth theory, one can actually present a radical critique both to the presupposition of a coherence criterion and to the presupposition of the set of propositions considered as true and whose relation of coherence should be simply made explicit and reconstructed. With respect to the first coherence foundation, the definition of the relationship of coherence, the Hegelian question is good debate, I think, from the beginning of the system, which is supposed to be free from any presupposition with respect to both the content and the method of immanent development of the logical content. The internal coherence underlying the development of the system is a coherence immanent in the content of thought, which initially is absolutely indeterminate. This coherence is not given, but it is generated in a process of self-determination of thought itself. And it is therefore, I think, a coherence under construction capable of making room also for radical inconsistency. It is a processual coherence, or the coherence of a thought that dialectically generates its form while remaining faithful to the internal development of its logical content. The second foundation presupposed by the coherent theories, that is the set of propositions considered as truth and assumed as reference for establishing the coherence relationship, is also can be also questioned from an Hegelian perspective. Actually, in Hegel's logic, this set, that is the unfolding of the system as a whole, is not presupposed. The system as a whole, as I showed in the first part of the talk, is certainly the foundation of the truth of every moment of the system. But it is at the same time generated, produced, and built by the dialectical development of every moment of the system itself. Furthermore, the moments of the system are not simply belief of a community of reference, and they do not simply pertain to the sphere of what we think and say. Rather, they are pure logical form of objective thought, which unfold also the pure ontological forms of reality. Precisely by considering truth as something generated, produced, and constructed by thought, we can finally move to consider the pragmatist theories of truth, according to which a proposition is true if it works. Truth is defined, for example, in terms of utility, or to believe is one that could be accepted at the end of inquiry. In both examples, the truth is a result of a process. This is why the pragmatist theories of truth are those that seem to be the closest to the sensibility of Hegel's philosophical proposal. In fact, in these theories, truth is not a static relationship between a truth bearer and a truth maker, but it is something that depends on the practice that are put in place when a problem is being solved or a certain assertion is being made, or more generally, when scientific research is being done. In fact, in Aemunds, notes the pragmatists share the idea that analysis of concepts is not a priori, but depends substantially on our practices and that knowledge of concept is linked to what we do with concepts and how we test them. On the basis of this consideration, Dinaemus recognizes a pragmatist spirit in Hegelian philosophy. Even if I don't completely agree with Emun's reading, I think we can recognize that the analysis of concepts in the logic depend on the practices internal to thought and on the way in which thought dialectically tests these practices. Furthermore, Hegel shares precisely the anti-foundationalist spirit with the pragmatist, and like the American pragmatist, he rejects the naive metaphysical realism that places the foundation of truth in a reality independent of thought. Pragmatists like Hegel criticize the correspondence theory of truth as abstract and ultimately metaphysical theories. In pragmatism, truth must certainly be defined in terms of correspondence, but this correspondence should not be interpreted as a relationship between a thought and an external datum. Rather, it is a correspondence of thought to the pragmatic evidence of value of the result of our concrete practice in thought and action. The most radical version of the pragmatist theory, such as that of Rossi, who declares himself to be radically anti-fundationalist, take the implicit contingency of our language as the basis, or we could say as a foundation, of the renunciation of the attempt to determine a properly objective truth. Truth is just what works. Therefore, we must question the very claim to know a truth that is not contextualized, historicized, relative, and therefore finite and contingent. In this way, however, the pragmatist theories, in the pragmatist theory, one can recognize a kind of crypto-fundationalism, and I agree with Maker on this point. In order to be true, a belief, a proposition, or a theory must be in relationship to correspondence to a presumed standard of pragmatic value or utility, assumed as a presupposition or as something just unjustified. Similarly, the more radical version of pragmatism, such as Rossi's, take as given foundation the contingency of language and as the contradictory absolutization of the relative position they present. Hegel's philosophical proposal, once again, can be used as a critical interlocutor of these theories and as a basis to re-articulate the conceptual core underlying the pragmatist proposal. On the one hand, Hegel assumes neither the pragmatic value of our practices nor the contingency of our language as given presuppositions to which our thinking should respond or correspond. On the contrary, thought is always and necessarily involved in a work of radical criticism and constant mediation of the way in which its categories are deposited within our ordinary language and therefore also in our practices. On the other hand, the truth of thought for Hegel has no foundation in practices and languages taken as data, but it is a truth that finds its foundation in itself, that is, in the reflective practices of self-determination of reason itself. This reason must think its very constitution, its form of existence, and it must therefore be understood and respected in its autonomy. The thought of this reason does not give up the challenge of determining a properly objective truth insofar as it is a thought that determines itself and its own foundation. Thought is necessarily involved in the challenge of showing its own objectivity and therefore its own truth. So I come to the conclusion. The central idea of the talk is that Hegel's theory of truth and its anti-fundationalism can provide a conceptual tools for criticizing the myth of a truth that finds its foundation, its truth maker, in something presupposed as given. This can be given as given facts external to thought in corresponding theories, a given foundation of a given definition of coherence and of the belief system assumed as true within the coherence theories, and the standard of utility, efficacy, and assertability within pragmatist proposals. The three theories analyzed are affected by what I called the myth of truth as a given. And this is testified by the fact that none of the three theories properly escape what Angelica Nuzzo calls the numismatic theory of truth. Truth, in this conception of truth, is like a coin. It is a value assigned to a proposition, belief or theory which, and I quote Nuzzo, is created by the arbitrary and abstract act of the meeting authority, end of quote. On the basis of the numismatic theory of truth, the logical space of truth is divided into two sections, truth and falsity. And we can assign its center to one of these sections depending on the minting authority, that is to say, the specific criterion of truth, its correspondence, coherence, or pragmatic value, which is presupposed and assumed as valid. Hence, truth value are properties assigned to sentences, beliefs, or theories on the basis of an external criterion that the sentence has to meet. The sentence, beliefs, and theories has to respect the authority of this criterion, which is external and assumed as given. If the authoritarian criterion is not met, the sentence, belief, or theory is false, and the negation of the sentence is thus true. In Hegel's logic, instead, the logical space is not divided between truth and falsity, I think. Strictly speaking, in Hegel's logic, there is one single logical space, which is the space of truth. That is, the truth of a thought that it needs to be progressively determined that it reaches its complete articulation. There is not an external agent that assigns truth to logical determination on the basis of some external given criteria. The matter at hand is not only in Hegel's logic the truth of cognition, beliefs or sentences, but the cognition of truth, which is the self-articulation of thought itself, which is objective thought, namely a thought that is one with being. Thought is the one and only logical space of truth that gradually develops itself by fully articulating its own content and thus by fully meeting its own criteria. Thought has to get through a gradual development of a truth that needs to be concretely and completely articulated along the whole development of the system itself. This does not imply an incompatibility between Hegel's proposal and the correspondence, coherence, and pragmatic theories of truth. I think that Hegel's philosophy is not incapable of recognizing the merits and the explicit potential of each of these theories. On the contrary, Hegel allows us to recognize their value and their effectiveness within representational thinking. At the same time, however, the way in which Hegel conceived reason and philosophical science also allows us to make explicit and to overcome the limitation of theories. The way in which they conceive thought and truth is always a truth intended as Richtigkeit. That is a property of proposition, belief, and theories that must correspond to a given criteria presupposed as valid. What lies beyond the limits of these theories is another type of thought, which we can call, in Hegelian terms, absolute thought. This thought must bring to light its own structure. Then it does not have to keep faith and respond to an external and authoritarian criteria, but only to itself and to its own form of self-determination. In this type of thinking, truth is thought as Wahrheit, which is never something given. On the contrary, it is a truth that has a processual character because it is a truth that is constituted on the basis of the process of mediation, foundation, and justification of the thought that generates it. Truth, as Wahrheit, therefore, has no substantial character, but it is subjectivity, that is, it is dynamic, processual, the development of a thought, which is meant to shed light on the dynamic, processual, and developmental character of reality itself. Muchas gracias.
Bien, muchas gracias a Michela por su interesante e importante aporte a la comprensión de la verdad en el pensamiento de Hegel y sobre todo en esta potente relación crítica que ha establecido con otras teorías, ¿no? Contemporáneas sobre el tema de la verdad. Bien, tenemos tiempo todavía para algunas preguntas, algunos comentarios por parte de nuestros participantes aquí en el Zoom. Pueden hacer sus preguntas por el chat, como veo que ya ha hecho, por ejemplo, André Uriarte, o pueden levantar la mano también y presentar su pregunta, su comentario a Michela en inglés, si lo desean, o en todo caso también puede ser en castellano, que Michela lo entiende muy bien. Entonces, tenemos una primera pregunta de André Uriarte, la voy a leer ¿no? Y le doy el pase a Michela para que la conteste. Would these theories of truth in the tradition of analytic philosophy also find a limit in a privileged, naive adoption of formal logic? How would the relations between speculative logic and formal logic be conceived today? Michela.
Okay, Andre, thank you so much for this question. It is the part of the talk that I wanted to develop in the final part of my presentation, but I did not have really any time to touch also this point. Actually, I hint at this point at just in one line of the presentation when I mentioned the numismatic theories of truth, and then of a logical space which is divided into sections, truth and false. This refers, of course, to the presupposition of the validity of the principle of equivalence. So what can I say about that? Just preliminary consideration. I'm not sure that all the version of the correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism theory of truth adopt we can attribute them a naive adoption of formal logic. I'm thinking just an example. For example, dialetheism, and I'm mentioning a non-classical logical conception of logic, which I've been working on. And so it is the thesis according to which some contradictions are true. This thesis is the most important philosophers that support this view is Priest. And I would not be sure that Priest would have any problem to endorse a correspondence theory of truth. So maybe not all correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism theory of truth have a naive adoption of formal logic. I think that, but I don't have the competence to develop in detail this answer. But I'm quite sure that in the three theories, there are some version who that casts doubt on this naive adoption of formal logic. I don't know if by naive adoption of formal logic you mean a classical adoption, or the adoption of classical logic. Maybe if I didn't get you right, just write a comment and I will try to reformulate my question. Okay, this was the preliminary answer. Speculative logic and formal logic. I don't see any incompatibility between formal logic and speculative logic. And I think that formal logic is part and a necessary condition in order to develop a speculative logic. Hegel himself, in various passages of the logic, mentioned the important, essential, fundamental work of Aristotle, and Hegel himself has a profound knowledge of this in the area study of logic of that time. So I see formal logic as a necessary condition in order to develop a speculative logic, because only by critically reflecting upon the categories of formal logic and also of traditional metaphysics, we can start construct a speculative logic. But formal logic, as well as the categories of our ordinary language too, plays a fundamental explicative power with respect to lots of a large context of the reality we live in. And so I think that with respect to this point, Hegel agrees with Priest, for example. They recognize that traditional logic as an important is necessary but not sufficient in order to explain how our language works, how reality is constituted, and so on. I don't know if the answer was satisfactory.
Gracias, Michela, por la respuesta. Thank you very much for the answer. ¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta, comentario por parte de nuestros participantes? Pueden levantar la mano, por favor. Bien, tenemos una pregunta de Julio Marchena. Sí, adelante, por favor.
Gracias, Yosimar. Y gracias, Michela, por tu presentación. Yo tengo una pregunta en referencia a la mención que haces de Rorty en tu paper, porque si entiendo bien el discurso de Rorty en torno a Hegel en Contingencia, Ironía y Solidaridad, justamente en el que hace una crítica a la historia de la metafísica, incluyendo a Hegel en esa visión en torno a la filosofía en general. ¿Cómo tú logras encajar a Rorty en este paper, ¿no? En esta lectura en la que lo concilia con el antifundacionalismo de Hegel, ¿no? Me interesa mucho que puedas desarrollar más esa idea, porque me parece muy interesante que, digamos, es otra lectura de la crítica rortiana a Hegel, ¿no? Como que los llegas a conciliar, si he entendido bien el punto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. This is a really important question. I think I cannot really answer in a proper way because I don't know Roth very much. But I think that they partly agree. Of course, Roth is considered Hegel an ironic philosopher, right? Because they both share a radical critique of fundationalism. Okay, so both can be considered anti-foundationalist. But Hegel is a strange kind of anti-foundationalist because it is a foundationalist who does not renounce to a foundationalism, to a proper foundation of philosophy. He just rethink this category. When I say this, I'm not saying anything original, okay? I am just presenting the ideas that are beautifully presented in a paper wrote by William Maker on Hegel and Rorty. And the title is something like how Hegel saved pragmatism from itself. And Maker beautifully traces this correspondence between Hegel's and Rorty's critique to anti-foundationalism, but at the same time, he shows how Hegel can allow us to make explicit the immanent, the inconsistency, the contradiction implicit in Rorty's position. So he is an anti-foundationalist that continues to give reason for his own position. In this sense, an Hegelian ironic critique of Rorty's irony would be, I think, a perfect way to rephrase with other conceptual tools some ideas that we find in Maker, in the paper written by William Maker, which was a great inspiration for me in this talk. It was this paper and the book Philosophy Without Foundation, together with some publication of Angelica Nusso, and especially the beautiful, amazing book by Franco Pierre-Again, Rileggere la scienza della logica, published in 2011. So most of the ideas that I presented are from these two inspirations to these three philosophers. But the work of William Maker is really perfect to to understand what is going on in this anti-foundational foundation that Hegel is trying to build along the system. And it can be used to criticize pragmatist anti-foundationalism. The answer was okay, it was satisfactory.
Una intervención de André Uriarte, nuevamente, que quisiera hacer una especificación sobre la pregunta que hizo. André, sí, por favor, adelante.
Hello there. Actually, I have to mention, first of all, that it was a really interesting speech. So, well, I would like to specify this expression of naive adoption of formal logic. Well, I was thinking of Robert Hanna paper entitled From an Ontological Point of View, Hegel's Critique of Common Logic. It was published, I think, in Hegel's Myths and Legends, published, edited by John Stewart. And well, I would like to quote a little passage of that work in order to specify what I meant by it. I could mention that this.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you put the quotation in the chat too, please?
I will try to.
Thank you.
But I can.
My English is not so good.
Mine neither, so sorry. Quizás también puedo hacer la especificación en español. No sé si se entiende. Bueno, en todo caso, cuando mencionaba esta cuestión de la adopción ingenua de la lógica, me refería, digamos, a lo que hace Kant, por ejemplo. Cuando Kant deriva las categorías puras del entendimiento, lo hace adoptando sin más la lógica de su época, ¿no? Que digamos es una lógica, o sea, no es la freudiana ni la que me parece que manejan actualmente estas teorías de la verdad, ¿no? En todo caso, mi pregunta sería, o sea, ¿podría diagnosticarse alguna clase de errores de, digamos, lo que sería una tendencia de transferir conceptos de la lógica formal de buenas a primeras o de manera ingenua a una consideración metafísica o ontológica o filosófica en general, ¿no? Porque una cosa es pensar la verdad en términos puramente lógicos y otra es pensarla ya como una cuestión del conocimiento o una cuestión ontológica. Esa sería mi duda. No sé si se entendió. Traté de poner la cita, pero no me permite, no me deja copiarla.
If I get you right, the problem is to transferring the conception of formal logic to a conception of general metaphysics. Also to use the concepts, some concepts of formal logic as presupposition to build a metaphysics.
O sea, bueno, no sé si se entendió bien lo que mencioné. Me refería, claro, o sea, digamos...
Starting from Kant and the problem of, yeah.
Yes.
So the problem is, if I got you right, I am considering Hegel's criticism of Kant. So when he criticized Kant to presuppose the table of judgment, and this becomes, in Kant, so to say, presupposition for what turns out to be Kant's metaphysics of experience. So, vamos a decir, Kant presupposes a series of categories on the basis of which he builds his metaphysics of experience. Of course, it is not a metaphysics in a strong sense. And the same happens, for example, also, if we think, but this is true. This is true for also for Aristotle, for example. There are a series of categories. I think about, for me, the clearest example is of the categories of identity, contradiction, and so on, which implies a determinate conception of metaphysics, normally a metaphysic which is made of substances states of affairs, facts, and so on, which are all these kinds of metaphysics are precisely the kind of metaphysics that are criticized by Hegelian metaphysics. And I think that the fundamental work, critical work that he does in the logic is to criticize this naive adoption of certain formal categories. For example, the kind of critique he develops about the notion of contradiction forced him to cast in doubts since the beginning of essence what is the result of the beginning of the doctrine of essence itself, which is a metaphysics based on the notion of substance. This is done explicitly with the dialectic, critical dialectic of the notion of substance, but this is already implicit with the critical analysis, critical dialectical and speculative analysis of the notion of contradiction. In this sense, I think Hegel does not endorse and does not have a naive adoption of formal logic, but still I don't know if I answered your question. Please feel free to reformulate it if what I said was not satisfactory.
Gracias, Michela. Thank you very much. No sé si tenemos otra pregunta. Tenemos todavía unos 3-4 minutos para una intervención más.
Can I make a comment on my own talk?
Por supuesto, adelante.
I just wanna the doubt with which I'm still here after my talk, and I just wanna share my doubt and my question and my problem with everyone here. If now in the contemporary debate in 2022, we can still talk of truth as not only as Richtigkeit, but also true in a stronger sense, true as Wahrheit, which means that truth has also material, metaphysical, ontological sense. And so can philosophy in the post-metaphysical era, and I was remembering the talk from Professor Mikhail yesterday, can philosophy continues to talk of truth as Wahrheit, or is it just something that needs to be kept in the history of the philosophy? This is just a question that leaves for you, and if someone wanna give some insights or suggestions. For me, that's the point. That's my problem.
Gracias. Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, creo que podríamos concluir con la conferencia de Michela, no sin antes agradecerle muchísimo a Michela por la presentación. Creo que ha sido una conferencia magistral en todo el peso del nombre, ¿no? Me ha dado mucho que pensar también en relación con estas otras teorías contemporáneas sobre la verdad. Creo que es una buena continuación de algunas cosas que Michela nos ha presentado también en el contexto de otros eventos organizados por el grupo Hegel a propósito del dialeteísmo, por ejemplo, ¿no? Que es una teoría que creo que me parece de mucha actualidad. Muchas gracias a los participantes por sus comentarios, por su presencia, y antes de despedirnos de esta mesa, quisiera invitarlos también a quedarse en línea para la siguiente parte de nuestra jornada, que va a ser un panel de discusión, ¿no? Donde tendremos la participación de Lelia Profili y de Pedro Sepúlveda, ¿no? Entre ambos van a desarrollar el tema de la circularidad de lo lógico, el comienzo final y su relevancia para el programa filosófico hegeliano. Muchas gracias por su presencia nuevamente y nos vemos en unos minutos. Muchas gracias, Michela. Nos vemos.
Muchas gracias.